They walked among the rocks of Petra for thousands of years, but we never saw them until the ground beneath the carved tomb cracked open. Beneath the famous treasury here in Petra, scientists found a sealed room. Inside were dozens of skeletons. These people lived before the city even existed. They died when Petra had yet to be born. What does it mean if our story of Petra starts not at its rise? What if it starts at a death long before its glory? Why were these people buried here? And why has history tried to bury them too? The answer changes everything we thought we knew about this ancient wonder. The sun rises over Petra. Light touches the rose-pink cliffs. This is one of the most famous places on Earth. People call it a wonder of the world. You enter through a narrow canyon. The walls rise high on both sides. They call this path the Sick. It winds through the rock for over a mile. The stone glows red and orange in the morning light. Then you see it. The treasury. It appears like magic at the end of the path. The building is carved right into the cliff face. Columns rise up. Statues look down. Every detail was cut by hand from solid rock over 2,000 years ago. But what lies beneath the surface? That stayed hidden. Until now. A team of scientists came to Petra. They were from the University of St Andrews. Others came from the American Center of Oriental Research. Jordanian experts joined them too. At first, they were just checking for flood damage. They wanted to protect the ancient site. Therefore, they brought special tools. These machines can see underground. They send signals into the earth. The signals bounce back. This shows what's hidden below. But the tools found something strange. There were empty spaces beneath the treasury. The chambers looked very old. They seemed to be from before the famous building above. The team stopped. This wasn't what they expected to find. Therefore, they had to rethink everything. One scientist saw something on the screen. It looked like a room. The room was sealed. No one had opened it in thousands of years. But was it real, or just a trick of the rocks? They had to know. Therefore, they asked for permission to dig. This took months. The Jordanian government had to approve. They had to make sure the site would stay safe. Finally, they got the answer. Yes, they could excavate. The team began to dig. The work went slowly. Every shovel of dirt mattered. Every stone could tell a story. But the chamber was deep. The entrance was blocked by tons of rock. Then they broke through. The sealed room opened. Darkness waited inside. The team shone lights into the space. What they saw made them freeze. Skeletons. 12 of them. They lay where they had been placed long ago. No one had moved them. No one had stolen from this tomb. It was perfect. One skeleton held something in its hands. It looked like a cup, or maybe a chalice. The object was made of clay. It had been fired in an ancient oven. The skeleton clutched it close. At first, the team thought maybe someone broke in recently. Maybe these bones weren't that old, but the seal on the chamber was solid. No one had been inside since the rocks closed it up. Therefore, they took samples. They needed to find out when these people died. The answer would change everything. But while they waited for results, questions grew. Who were these people? Why bury them beneath the most famous building in Petra? And why had no one found them before? The accepted story of Petra goes like this. The Nabateans arrived around 300 BC. They were desert traders. They moved spices and incense across the Arabian desert. They got rich from this trade. Therefore, they built a great city in the rocks. The treasury came later. Experts said it was carved around 100 BC to 100 AD. It became the symbol of Petra. It represented their power and wealth. But now this tomb challenged that story. If the chamber was sealed before the treasury was built, then what? Did someone live here first? Did a whole other people walk these canyons before the Nabateans arrived? The team studied the skeletons carefully. They took photos. They measured bones. They collected samples of dirt and pottery. Every clue mattered. Every detail could unlock the mystery. But one thing was clear already. These weren't just random bones. This was a proper burial. Someone cared about these people. Someone took time to lay them to rest with ceremony. Someone placed that chalice in the skeleton's hands. Therefore, this was important. These people meant something to someone. But who were they? And what happened to them? The camera pulls back. The treasury stands silent above. The tourists walk by. They take pictures. They marvel at the carved stone. But they don't know what sleeps beneath their feet. The real story of Petra is about to change. Let's go back in time. Let's learn about the people we thought built Petra, the Nabateans. They started as nomads. They wandered the Arabian desert. They knew where the water was. They knew the safe paths through the rocks. Therefore, they became the perfect guides for trade caravans. Merchants needed to move spices from Yemen. They needed to bring incense from Arabia. These goods went to Rome and Greece. They went to Egypt. The journey was long and dangerous, but the Nabateans made it possible. They charged fees. They provided protection. They offered rest stops in the desert. Therefore, they grew wealthy, very wealthy. Around 300 BC, they decided to settle down. They picked this place, these red rock canyons. Why here? Water. There were springs in the rocks, and the narrow canyon made defense easy. One small group of warriors could hold off an army in the sick. Therefore, Petra was born. That's what we always believed. The Nabateans carved tombs into the cliffs. They built temples. They created water systems that still amaze engineers today. The treasury became their masterpiece. Every detail showed their skill. Every column proved their power. But much about their origin stayed mysterious. Where exactly did they come from? What language did they speak before they started writing? How did they learn to carve stone so perfectly? Previous digs found tombs. The Northridge tombs gave scientists some answers. These graves held skeletons from around 100 AD. They found pottery too, and jewellery. These discoveries taught us about Nabatean life, but they were incomplete. Grave robbers had stolen most of the treasures long ago. Therefore, scientists wanted more. They needed untouched sites. They needed perfect burials that could tell the whole story. That's when technology changed everything. The team brought ground-penetrating radar to Petra. They brought electromagnetic sensors too. These machines had never been fully used here before. The tools could see through solid rock. They could map empty spaces. They could show where chambers might be hiding. Therefore, the team decided to scan beneath the treasury. It was the most famous building. But had anyone checked what was underneath? The answer was no. No one had looked. Therefore, they started scanning. The results shocked them. There were voids, multiple chambers. They sat right beneath the courtyard in front of the treasury. The spaces looked big enough for burials, maybe even big enough for treasure. But getting permission to dig took time. The Jordanian authorities had to weigh many factors. Petra brings millions of tourists every year. It generates huge revenue. What if digging damaged the site? What if nothing important was there? Therefore, the team waited. Months passed. They presented their data again and again. They showed why this mattered. They promised to be careful. Finally, permission came through. They could dig, but only in specific spots. And everything had to be documented, every single step. The excavation began. The team removed modern fill first. Tourists had walked on this courtyard for decades. Dirt had piled up. But beneath that came older layers, much older. Then they hit the seal. A line of stones marked where the ancient chamber began. These rocks had been placed on purpose. Someone had closed this room long ago. Someone had wanted it to stay shut. The team carefully removed the stones. One by one, the chamber opened. Cool air rushed out. It smelled of dust and time. Inside, the 12 skeletons waited. They lay in careful positions. Some curled on their sides, others lay on their backs. One small skeleton was a child, maybe 8 years old. An adult skeleton lay next to the child. Were they family? Mother and child? Father and daughter? The skeleton with the chalice lay separate from the others. Its position suggested importance. Maybe this person was a priest, or a leader, or someone the community respected greatly. But when did they die? That was the key question. Everything depended on the date. Therefore, they sent samples to multiple labs. Bone fragments went to radiocarbon specialists. Dirt samples went to sediment experts. Pottery shards went to ceramic analysts. The team expected the results to confirm the standard timeline. These people would be Nabatean. They would date to around 100 BC to 100 AD. They would fit the accepted story, but the results came back different, very different. Therefore, everything changed. The dates showed the tomb was older, much older than expected. The burial happened before the treasury above was carved. These people died before Petra became great. The timeline was backwards. The end came before the beginning. The accepted story was wrong. The bones tell stories if you know how to read them. Therefore, the team brought in forensic experts. These scientists study skeletons for a living. They can tell age, they can tell sex, they can even tell how someone died. The experts examined each skeleton carefully. They looked at bone density, they checked tooth wear, they measured skull shapes. The work took weeks. What did they find? No signs of violence, no broken bones from battle, no marks from weapons. These people didn't die in war, therefore something else killed them. But what? The child skeleton lay next to an adult. Their position suggested care. Someone had placed them together on purpose. This wasn't a mass grave from plague. This wasn't bodies thrown in quickly. This was a proper burial with love and ritual. But the mystery deepened. If these weren't Nabateans, who were they? The bones couldn't answer that. Therefore, the team needed more evidence. Dr. Tim Kinnaird led the sediment analysis. He's a scientist who studies dirt. That sounds simple. But dirt is complex. It holds secrets. He took samples from around the skeletons. He studied the layers. Each layer represents a different time period, like pages in a book. The oldest layer sits on the bottom, the newest on top. The tests showed something surprising. The chamber was built in the mid-1st century BC, but the generally accepted date for the treasury was later, around the 1st century AD. Therefore, the chamber came first. Then the monument was built above it later. This changed everything. The treasury wasn't the beginning of Petra. It was built on top of something older. Therefore, an earlier community lived here first. They died here. They were buried with ceremony. Then, later, someone built the great monument above their graves. But who were they? DNA testing might help. Therefore, samples went to genetics labs. The scientists extracted ancient DNA from bone marrow. This is hard work. DNA breaks down over time, but sometimes enough survives to tell us where people came from. The preliminary results showed something unexpected. Some of the DNA markers didn't match local populations. Therefore, some of these people might have come from somewhere else. They might have been travellers, or traders, or refugees from a distant land. But the analysis wasn't complete. More testing was needed. Therefore, the mystery continued. The chalice drew attention from everyone. It sat in the skeleton's hands like a treasure. The media loved it. They called it the Petra Grail. They wrote dramatic headlines. They compared it to the Holy Grail from legends. The archaeologists pushed back. They urged caution. Yes, the vessel looked dramatic. Yes, its position suggested ritual importance. But jumping to conclusions helps no one. Science requires proof. Therefore, they studied the chalice carefully. It was made of local clay. The firing technique matched other pottery from the region, but the style was slightly different, slightly older. Therefore, it dated to before the classic Nabatean period. This microclimax hit hard. The tomb wasn't just old, it was older than Petra's famous buildings. Therefore, the treasury facade was built above an existing burial ground. The iconic monument stood on top of forgotten graves. Think about what this means. The symbol of Petra isn't the beginning. It's built on someone else's ending. The rose-coloured stone, the perfect columns, the statues looking down, all of it sits above 12 skeletons who were there first. But why? Why build there? Did the later Nabateans know about the graves? Did they choose that spot on purpose? Or was it accident? Some experts think it was intentional. Ancient people often built important structures on sacred ground. Maybe the earlier burial site was holy. Maybe it marked something special about the location. Therefore, the Nabateans chose it for their most important monument. But other experts disagree. They think the Nabateans didn't know. They think the earlier burial was forgotten. The chamber was sealed, the ground was flat. Therefore, it looked like perfect building space. We don't know which theory is right. Both make sense. Both fit the evidence. Therefore, the debate continues. But one thing became clear. Petra was older than we thought. The story began earlier. Therefore, everything we learned before needed to be reconsidered. If the tomb predates the monument, what else is hidden? What other chambers wait beneath the ground? What other stories have we missed? The team's discovery opened a door, but behind that door lay many more doors. Therefore, the excavation had to continue. Let's review what we thought we knew. The Nabateans arrived around 300 BC. They built Petra over several centuries. The treasury was their masterpiece. It showed their wealth and power. That's the traditional story. But this discovery forces new questions. Was Petra built on top of an older settlement? Did another civilization live here first? And if so, what happened to them? The remote sensing team wasn't done. They kept scanning. They found more voids around the treasury complex, more empty chambers, more hidden spaces beneath the ground. Therefore, the single tomb wasn't alone. There might be many more, but excavating requires money. It requires permits. It requires years of work. The team didn't have unlimited resources. Therefore, progress slowed. The other chambers remained sealed. Their secrets stayed hidden. This raised the stakes. Every day that passed meant more questions without answers. Every delay meant the truth stayed buried. Therefore, the team pushed hard for more funding. They wrote grant proposals. They gave lectures. They showed their findings to anyone who would listen. Some specialists remained skeptical. They argued the tomb might be an isolated case. Maybe these 12 people were special. Maybe they were foreigners who died passing through. Maybe their burial here didn't mean a whole earlier civilization. But other experts saw patterns. They studied the ceramics. The pottery styles matched each other. They studied the architecture. The chamber design showed consistent building techniques. Therefore, this wasn't random. This suggested an organized community, a community that had customs and traditions. A community that built things to last. The debate grew heated. Academic careers depend on being right. Reputations rise and fall on new discoveries. Therefore, some archaeologists defended the old timeline. They didn't want to admit they might have been wrong for decades, but the evidence kept piling up. The radiocarbon dates were solid. The sediment layers were clear. The DNA markers were unusual. Therefore, the traditional story couldn't stand unchanged. The Jordanian authorities watched carefully. Tourism is crucial for Jordan's economy. Petra brings in millions of dollars every year. The treasury's image appears on postcards and currency. It defines Jordan's heritage brand. Therefore, any change to Petra's story had implications. Would tourists care about an earlier burial? Would it make the site more interesting or less? Would it require new signs and explanations? And what would that cost? But Jordan's Department of Antiquities also cared about truth. They wanted accurate history. They wanted to honour all the people who lived and died in this land. Therefore, they supported continued research. They approved more excavations in limited areas. Then came a major turning point. A specialist in Nabatean architecture examined the treasury again. She studied the carving techniques. She looked at tool marks. She compared them to other buildings at Petra. Her conclusion shocked everyone. The treasury showed signs of being built in stages. The lower portions used slightly different techniques than the upper portions. The stone had different weathering patterns. Therefore, the building wasn't carved all at once. It was added to over time. But here's what mattered most. The earliest carving phase happened after the burial chamber was sealed. The evidence was in the rock itself. Therefore, the monument was definitely built after the people in the tomb died. This wasn't one scientist's opinion. This was physical evidence in stone. Therefore, the debate shifted. Now the question wasn't if the tomb was older. The question was, how much older and who were these people? Suddenly, the story changed. It was no longer about who built Petra. Now it was about who was here before Petra, and why did they disappear? The implications spread like ripples in water. If Petra had a pre-Nabatean phase, what about other sites in Jordan? What about other ancient cities? How many of our origin stories might be wrong? The team realised they were writing new history, not just for Petra, not just for Jordan, but for our understanding of how civilizations rise in the ancient Near East. The treasury was famous because it represented a civilization at its peak, but now it represented something else too. It represented forgetting. It represented one people building on top of another. It represented how easily the past disappears. Therefore, the investigation took on new urgency. The team needed to find more evidence. They needed to discover who these people were before time erased all traces. The stakes were no longer academic. They were about memory, about making sure these 12 souls weren't forgotten again. The skeletons showed no battle wounds, no broken bones, no signs of violence, but they were buried in a richly made chamber. Someone spent time and effort on this tomb. Therefore, these people were valued by their community. But where was the treasure? Most ancient burials of important people contained valuable objects: gold, silver, precious stones. This tomb had pottery. It had the chalice, but nothing that grave robbers would steal. Therefore, something disrupted their world before valuable goods could be included. Or perhaps they simply didn't have wealth to spare. The artifacts told their own story. Bronze tools, some iron pieces, ceramics with interesting designs. The experts dated these objects. They matched but slightly predated the common Nabatean styles. Therefore, this community existed in a transition period. They were connected to trade networks, but they weren't yet the wealthy merchants we know from later. Inside the chamber, one detail caught everyone's attention. A ceiling block had collapsed centuries ago, but it collapsed after the burial. Therefore, it sealed some skeletons perfectly. It protected them from air and moisture. It preserved them in time. This was luck, pure luck. But it meant those particular skeletons were in excellent condition. Therefore, they provided the best samples for analysis. They held the clearest DNA. They showed the most complete bone structure. But the chamber showed other damage too. The fill above the burials showed disturbance. Different types of dirt mixed together. Therefore, people had entered the area above the tomb in later periods. Maybe they didn't know the chamber existed below. Maybe they did and didn't care. Either way, the site had multiple phases of use. This complexity told a story of its own. The ground beneath Petra wasn't static. It wasn't a simple timeline. Different groups used the same spaces in different ways. Therefore, understanding one burial required understanding centuries of activity. The researchers began asking difficult questions. Did a disaster wipe out this earlier community? Earthquakes hit this region regularly. The rock faults make the area unstable. Therefore, an earthquake could have destroyed their settlement. But the skeletons showed no trauma, no crushed bones, no signs of being buried alive. Therefore, if an earthquake struck, it didn't kill these specific people. Maybe they died before it. Or maybe they died during an epidemic. Or maybe they simply died naturally and were buried with honor. The absence of answers became its own answer. We couldn't know for certain how they died, but we could know they mattered to someone. Therefore, the burial itself was the message. Someone cared enough to dig this chamber. Someone cared enough to seal it properly. Why did they stop using the chamber? That question haunted the researchers. The chamber could have held more burials. There was space, but it was sealed and never reopened. Therefore, something changed. The community either left or changed their burial customs. Some experts proposed climate change. The desert expanded and contracted over centuries. Water sources shifted. Therefore, settlements moved. People followed the water. Other experts suggested conflict, not war necessarily, but competition for resources, pressure from neighbouring groups. Therefore, the community might have relocated somewhere safer, or been absorbed into a larger group, but there was no direct evidence for any theory. Therefore, the mystery remained. The chamber was sealed. The people were buried. Time passed. Then the Nabateans arrived and built their great city. The earlier community was forgotten. Until now. Until remote sensing and careful excavation brought them back to light. Therefore, they could speak again. Not with words, but with bones and pottery, and the chamber itself. The traditional story of Petra assumed a clear beginning. Nomads arrived. They settled. They prospered. They built monuments. But real history is messier. Real history involves layers, different peoples, different periods, false starts and forgotten chapters. This discovery proved that the beginning wasn't the beginning. Therefore, our assumptions about how cities form needed revision. We couldn't just look at the monuments. We had to look beneath them. We had to ask who came before and who might have been erased. The narrator poses a final question for this section. The beginning is after death. That sounds like a riddle, but it's not. It's truth. The earliest chapter of Petra began with these 12 burials. Death came first. Then came the city. The monuments were built on graves. Therefore, the true origin of Petra is underground. In darkness, in bones. All the evidence converged. The radiocarbon dates, the sediment analysis, the pottery styles, the DNA markers. They all pointed to the same conclusion. Therefore, the sacred moment arrived. The moment when scattered facts became one clear truth. The tomb predated the treasury. Not by years, by generations. By enough time that when the Nabateans carved their masterpiece, these 12 souls had been sleeping beneath the ground for decades, maybe longer. Let's lay out the new story, the real story, the one written in bones and stone. A community lived here long before Petra became famous. They weren't wealthy, they weren't powerful, but they were here. They knew these canyons. They found water in the springs. They traded with passing caravans. They survived in the harsh desert. When people died, the community buried them with care. They carved chambers into the soft sandstone. They placed bodies with ceremony. One person held a chalice. Was it religious? Was it meaningful in a way we can't understand now? We don't know, but it mattered to them. Then something happened. Maybe disaster, maybe slow decline, maybe they simply moved on. The chamber was sealed, the last ceremonies performed. The entrance was covered. Time passed, decades, maybe a century. The desert covered the burial sites, the rock weathered, the memory faded. Then the Nabateans arrived. They were different people. They came with different customs, different gods, different languages. They looked at these red cliffs and saw opportunity. They saw defensible canyons. They saw water. They saw a perfect location for a trading city. Therefore, they built. They carved tombs. They created temples. And they chose one particular cliff face for their greatest achievement: the treasury. They didn't know, or maybe didn't care, that they were building on top of graves. They created their monument above someone else's ending. Professor Richard Bates from the University of St Andrews said it best. Very few complete burials from the early Nabateans have ever been recovered from Petra before. The burials can all be expected to help fill the gaps. But these weren't even Nabatean burials. They were pre-Nabatean. Therefore, the gaps they filled were bigger than anyone expected. They revealed an entire missing chapter in Petra's history. The skeletons became more than bones now. They became people again. The child who died young, the adult who lay beside them, the person who held the chalice. Each one had lived. Each one had loved and feared and hoped. Each one had walked these same red rocks under the same bright sun. Then they died. And they were forgotten, their names lost, their language silent, their stories erased by time and stone, until a ground-penetrating radar saw what human eyes couldn't. Until scientists cared enough to dig carefully, until the truth emerged from darkness into light. This carries emotion, real emotion, because these weren't abstract ancient people. They were real. They lived where we stand. They saw the same stars. They felt the same desert wind. And their civilization was overwritten, literally. The Nabateans built the treasury right on top of their burial ground, not out of malice, just out of ignorance, just because time had hidden them so completely. This happens throughout history. One group builds on the ruins of another. Cities stack on top of cities. The winner writes the story. The loser is forgotten. Therefore, archaeology matters. It gives voice to the voiceless. It remembers the forgotten. The implications spread far beyond Petra. If our model for Petra's origin was wrong, what else might be wrong? How many other ancient cities started differently than we think? How many other forgotten peoples wait beneath famous monuments? The Near East is full of ancient sites. Babylon, Palmyra, Jerash. Each one has an official story. Each one has a presumed beginning. But how many have secret chambers beneath? How many have pre-foundation communities we haven't found? Therefore, this discovery changed the field. It challenged archaeologists everywhere to look deeper, to question assumptions, to scan beneath their famous buildings, to ask who was here first. The chalice gleams in museum lighting now. The skeleton that held it rests in storage. The chamber sits empty beneath the ground. But the story lives. The new story. The true story. The one that starts with death but reveals life. 12 people, a sealed chamber. A monument built above them, and 2,000 years later, their voice breaks through stone and time to speak one clear message. We were here. We mattered. Remember us. The excavation continues. The team didn't stop with one chamber. They keep scanning. They keep digging. They keep finding. Because every answer creates new questions. Therefore, the work goes on. Other voids show up on the radar. Other chambers wait beneath the treasury complex. Maybe they hold more skeletons. Maybe they hold different artifacts. Maybe they'll confirm the story or complicate it further. No one knows until they dig. The Jordanian Department of Antiquities is rethinking Petra's presentation. They're planning new signs, new explanations. They want visitors to know the full story, not just the famous treasury, but the hidden beginning beneath it. Therefore, guides are being trained. They'll tell tourists about the discovery. They'll explain what the chamber means. They'll help people understand that history has layers, that the visible is just the beginning. The research team reflects on what they found. Professor Piers Paul Kriesman leads the group. He knew the discovery would be important, but he didn't expect it to rewrite the timeline. None of them did. Dr. Kinnaird thinks about the sediment samples. He spent weeks analysing dirt. It sounds boring, but that dirt revealed when the chamber was built. Therefore, his patience mattered. His careful work mattered. Science isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just being thorough. The local Bedouin communities watch with interest. Their ancestors have lived around Petra for generations. They have oral histories, stories passed down. Some of those stories mention older peoples, people who lived before the Nabateans. Therefore, the discovery confirms what some locals always believed. The land remembers even when history books forget. For viewers around the world, this story carries a lesson. The monuments we see are often tips of icebergs. The famous buildings sit on top of foundations we can't see. Therefore, assumptions are dangerous. We have to dig deeper. We have to look beneath the surface. This applies beyond archaeology. How many modern cities hide older settlements? How many contemporary stories erase earlier voices? How many times do we assume we know the beginning when we're really seeing the middle? The bones speak across time. They challenge our certainties. They remind us how fragile our narratives are. One ground-penetrating radar scan, one sealed chamber. 12 skeletons, and suddenly 2,000 years of accepted history shifts. The emotional weight of this settles slowly. These were people, not characters in a story, not abstract ancient figures. Real people with real lives. They woke up each morning. They ate meals. They raised children. They buried their dead with ceremony. Then they were forgotten. Completely. Their entire civilization reduced to silence. Therefore, this discovery is also a rescue from oblivion. The scientists gave these 12 people their voice back. Let's return to the hook. We started at the end. Remember that phrase? Now it makes complete sense. The tomb is death, but it's also the starting line of history. The story of Petra begins with 12 bodies in a sealed chamber. The treasury facade appears on screen again, but now it looks different. It's still beautiful, still awe-inspiring, but it's layered with meaning. Above the surface, carved perfection. Below the surface, forgotten graves. The skeleton clutching the vessel comes back into frame. This image opened the documentary. Now it closes it. But we understand it differently. We know who this person was. Not their name, not their specific story, but their role in history. They were here first. They were the beginning. A voiceover asks the final question. What we thought was the beginning was really someone else's ending. What stories are we still missing? That question hangs in the air. It lingers. Because it's unanswerable. We don't know what we don't know. Therefore, we have to keep looking, keep digging, keep questioning, keep remembering that every first might come after something earlier. The screen fades to black. The words appear. For the 12 beneath the treasury, may you never be forgotten again. What else lies beneath our cities? What else hides beneath our textbooks? What else waits beneath our assumptions? The ground keeps its secrets until someone cares enough to ask, until someone looks beneath the monuments, until someone gives voice to silence. Petra isn't just a tourist site anymore. It's a reminder, a lesson, a challenge. Look deeper, question more. Remember that history has layers, and the people buried at the bottom matter just as much as the ones who built on top. The documentary ends, but the story continues, because beneath every ending waits another beginning.